The whisper before the signature, the boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Long glass walls reflected the city skyline, sunlight bouncing off the polished marble table where some of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley sat waiting. Sundar Pichai leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him, his calm eyes scanning the pages of the contract that promised a revolutionary partnership worth $100 million. It was the kind of deal most CEOs dreamed of, bold, strategic, and transformative. But somewhere deep in his gut, he felt a strange heaviness, a voice he couldn't quite silence, telling him something about this contract wasn't right. The men across from him were confident, almost too confident. They smiled with a rehearsed charm, each word polished like glass, each gesture calculated to radiate trust. One of them, a silver-haired executive named Harrison, leaned in and said softly, "This is history, Sundar. Once you sign, the world will remember today as the day Google reshaped the future." His tone was persuasive, his words heavy with importance. And yet, Sundar noticed the quick flicker of eyes between Harrison and his partner, as if they shared a secret that wasn't written in any of the papers spread out across the table. But Sundar was a man used to pressure, used to decisions that could make or break billions. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Still, his eyes lingered on the fine print at the bottom of the page, the words blending into a blur, as if they were hiding something outside the boardroom. Life moved differently. Cleaners moved quietly through the hallways, invisible to the eyes of those in power. Among them was a woman named Lena. She was a maid, her uniform plain and slightly faded, her shoes worn from years of walking long corridors with a mop and bucket. To the executives, she was just background, a shadow moving silently around them. But Lena carried within her a sharpness, a wisdom born not from books, but from life itself. She had learned to observe the world carefully, because for people like her, observation was survival that morning. While dusting near the conference area, Lena's eyes had caught a glimpse of the contract. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. Papers were always on tables, but something had pulled her gaze back. The company name in small print, the numbers on a specific clause. Her brother had once been caught in a similar scam, losing his. Small business to men who smiled while stealing. She had memorized the tricks they used, the way they hid poison inside promises. Her heart began to race as she pieced it together. What she saw in that contract was not a partnership. It was a trap inside the boardroom Sundar was about to sign. The pen rested between his fingers, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Every executive in the room leaned forward, waiting for the moment of history. Then came the whisper. "Sir, that's the wrong contract." It was so soft you almost thought you imagined it. Sundar froze, the pen inches above the paper. He turned slightly, and there she was, the maid, standing by the door with her cleaning cart, her eyes fixed on him. Her voice was low but steady, her face pale but determined. The room erupted. The executives exchanged furious glances, their charm cracking into hostility. One of them barked, "What are you doing in here? Get her out." But Sundar raised his hand, silencing them. His gaze stayed on Lena, his mind racing. The air turned heavy, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. The maid's whisper had not just interrupted a billion-dollar deal. It had shifted the balance of power in a room. Sundar, quotes, S calm voice broke the silence. "What did you just say?" Lena swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she gripped her card. "That's the wrong contract, sir." "They're trying to trick you?" Gasps filled the room, but Sundar's eyes did not leave hers. In that instant, he knew this moment would decide everything. He could dismiss her, laugh it off, or he could listen to the woman no one else saw. The executives leaned forward again, their voices sharp, trying to cut through the tension. "Mr. Pichai, she doesn't know what she's talking about. These are confidential documents. She's overstepping." But Sundar's hand tightened around the pen. His heart pounded, his instincts screamed louder now. He had learned long ago that truth sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. He pushed the contract away slowly and turned his full attention to Lena. Tell me exactly what you saw. The executives stiffened, panic flashing across their faces. Lena hesitated, fear rising in her chest, but she also knew if she stayed silent now, this man and maybe thousands of his employees would pay the price. She took a shaky breath, ready to speak, and just as she opened her mouth, the door to the boardroom burst open and another figure walked in, holding a folder that looked exactly like the one Sundar had been about to sign. The room froze. Sundar's eyes narrowed and everything he thought he knew about trust, loyalty, and danger was about to change. Asterisk, the maid's truth man who walked into the boardroom, carried himself with the hurried steps of someone who wasn't supposed to be late. His suit was crisp, his folder clutched tightly in one hand, his forehead glistening slightly with sweat. Everyone in the room turned their heads at once, the tension now thick enough to choke on. Sundar's pen still hovered in the air, the words of the maid echoing in his ears like a bell refusing to stop ringing. I apologize for the delay, the newcomer said, his breath uneven as he placed the folder on the table. The real contract had to be reprinted at the last minute. For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Sundar's gaze moved slowly between the folder, the men who had pressured him to sign, and the maid still standing in the doorway. The executives exchanged glances, their composure cracking, though they tried desperately to mask it with smiles. Harrison forced a laugh. There seems to be some misunderstanding. This is embarrassing, but easily explained. But Sundar wasn't convinced. He had built his career not by being the loudest in the room, but by listening to the quietest. Signals, the small hesitations, the details others overlooked. His mind replayed Lena's whisper, the urgency in her eyes, the way she had risked her job to speak up. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Embarrassing, yes. But misunderstandings this large don't happen by accident. His voice was calm, but underneath it was steel. The executive stiffened. One of them shuffled his papers, another cleared his throat, but their eyes betrayed them, nervous, cornered. Sundar felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder now. This wasn't just about him. If he signed the wrong contract, thousands of employees, millions of users, and the reputation of everything he had built could collapse like glass shattering on stone. Then he looked back at Lena. She stood frozen, gripping her cart, her eyes darting to the floor as if ashamed for interrupting something far above her place. Sundar spoke again, this time softer, directed only at her. What did you see? Her voice trembled, but it carried truth. The name, sir. The small company listed in the fine print. It's a shell. I've seen it before. She hesitated, swallowing as memories rose like unwanted ghosts. My brother had a garage business. He trusted men like them. They offered him money, contracts, filled with promises. But the small company they used, it wasn't real. It drained his savings, stole his rights, left him with nothing. Her hands tightened around the cart handle. That clause at the bottom, it's the same trick. They want to lock you into something that looks fair, but gives them full control. Every word she spoke landed like thunder in the silent room. Sundar listened carefully, his respect for her growing with each passing second. Here was a woman, invisible to the world, yet she carried an awareness sharper than the lawyers he paid millions to dot the executives, could no longer hide their unease. One of them snapped, his voice sharp like a whip. This is outrageous. You're going to trust a cleaning woman over us, over years of professional expertise? Sundar's calm eyes met his, and for the first time in the meeting, he smiled faintly. Sometimes wisdom doesn't wear a suit. The maid lowered her head, fighting tears. For years she had been dismissed, ignored, made to feel her voice was worth nothing. And now the most powerful man in the room had chosen to hear her, but the danger wasn't over. Sundar signaled for his legal team to compare the two contracts, the one on the table and the one just delivered. As they flipped pages, their faces slowly drained of color. Clauses were missing. Ownership rights had been shifted. Entire sections, designed to protect Google, had been stripped away. Sir. One lawyer whispered, this first contract would have given them control of the intellectual property. They would own everything. The air in the room snapped like a rope pulled too tight. Sundar's eyes darkened. He turned his gaze back to Harrison, who shifted in his seat, his confident mask dissolving into something uglier. You tried to sell me a lie, Sundar said, his voice low but cutting. The men began to protest, but their voices were no longer polished, no longer in control. Sundar raised his hand, silencing them. Get out, he said simply. This meeting is over. Rage flickered in their eyes, but they had no ground left to stand on. They gathered their things quickly, muttering excuses, their footsteps heavy as they stormed out of the boardroom. When the door closed, the silence returned, but this time it was different. The storm had passed, but the air carried the weight of what almost happened. Sundar sat still for a moment, staring at the contract that could have destroyed everything. Finally turned back to Lena. She stood trembling, half expecting to be scolded, maybe even fired for interrupting. Instead, Sundar rose from his chair and walked slowly toward her. You saved me today, he said softly. And not just me. You saved a company, thousands of people who depend on us. Her lips parted, but no words came. Tears blurred her vision. No one had ever said something like that to her. Not in this building. Not in any building dot, but just as gratitude filled the air. A darker shadow slipped in. Because what Lena and Sundar didn't know was that Harrison and his partners were not finished. Humiliation in that boardroom was only the beginning. Men like them didn't forget. They didn't forgive, and somewhere outside, in the quiet of the parking garage, one of the executives pulled out his phone, his voice sharp as he spoke into it. He knows the maid ruined it. We'll have to deal with both of them. The threat had already begun. Asterisk shadows in the glass day after the failed contract signing. The Google campus looked the same to most people. Bright glass towers. Manicured gardens, employees hurrying between meetings with coffee in hand. But to Sundar, something felt different. Behind the shine of the morning sun, a shadow seemed to lurk. He had faced competition before, even hostility, but this felt darker, more personal. Sundar sat in his office, staring out at the skyline. He should have been relieved a $100 million scam had been stopped before it swallowed the company whole. Yet instead of peace, he felt a storm building. He replayed Lena's whisper in his mind, the way her voice trembled, yet cut through the noise with truth. It was her courage that had saved him, not the army of advisors, not the lawyers, not the executives. And that realization unsettled him. How could a woman so invisible to the powerful see what they could not? He reached for the phone and asked his assistant to send for Lena. Minutes later, she stood at the edge of his office, clutching her hands nervously in front of her. She had never been inside a room like this before, the walls lined with books, awards, and pictures from around the world. She felt small, almost out of place, but Sundar's gentle nod eased her unease. You were brave yesterday, he said quietly. You risked your job to warn me. Her eyes lowered. I only did what I had to. I couldn't stay silent. My brother. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. I knew the signs. I couldn't watch it happen again, not to someone else. Sundar studied her carefully. Your brother? What happened to him? Her breath shivered as she spoke, each word heavy with memory. He ran a small repair shop. He worked so hard. Believed that contracts and promises meant protection. But those men, they trapped him with clauses he didn't see. He lost his shop, his savings, his hope. He died believing he was a failure, but it wasn't his fault. It was theirs. Her eyes glistened, her voice breaking. When I saw that contract, I saw his face again. I couldn't let it happen to you. The room fell silent. Sundar felt the weight of her story settle in his chest. He thought of the millions of people who trusted him to lead with fairness, to build with honesty, to never be careless with their futures. Lena's story was a reminder. Power and vulnerability were two sides of the same coin. But outside the office, the world moved with unseen hands. Harrison sat in the back of a black car parked in a dim garage. His face, once smooth with charm, was now twisted with anger. His phone pressed against his ear, his voice low but seething. He made me look like a fool. We were this close, and that maid ruined everything. The man on the other end spoke calmly. You want us to apply pressure? Harrison's jaw clenched. More than pressure. Send a message. Make him uncomfortable. Remind him that power comes with a price. His fingers drummed against the leather seat. And find the maid. She opened her mouth once. I don't want her to open it again. Yes. The car pulled away. Darkness followed Dot back at Google. Sundar had just ended his meeting with Lena. Before she left, he had looked at her kindly and said, You are not invisible here. Remember that. Her chest tightened at his words. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and ignored suddenly washed against the kindness of being seen. But as she stepped out into the evening air, pushing her cleaning cart across the quiet hall, she felt eyes on her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the echoes of her nerves. But when she turned toward the glass wall, she caught the reflection of a man standing too still in the corner, watching her. When she blinked, he was gone. That night, Sundar returned home later than usual. His house was quiet, his family asleep. He moved to his study, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. As he set his briefcase down, he noticed something odd. A single sheet of paper slipped. Under his door dot, his heart quickened as he unfolded it. There were no words, just a photograph. It was the boardroom table from the day before, taken secretly. In the photo, Sundar's hand hovered above the contract, the pen inches away from the paper. And scrawled in red ink across the bottom were 5 chilling words. Next time you won't stop. Sundar's fingers trembled slightly as he lowered the photo. His instincts told him this wasn't just a threat against him. Lena's whisper had made her a target too. He looked out the window into the night, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. He knew one thing for certain now. The storm had begun, and both he and Lena were standing in its path. And in the darkness, a question echoed in his mind. How do you fight enemies who hide in shadows, when even light feels too dangerous to trust? Asterisk, the day the cameras blink at morning after the threat. The campus looked ordinary on the surface, but Sundar noticed how silence can change color when danger passes through it. The glass buildings still threw light on the walkways. The bikes still clicked along the lanes, and the coffee carts still filled paper cups with steam. Yet, there was a thin film over everything, as if the city of work wore a mask. He reached the security desk before his first meeting and asked quietly for a copy of the previous night's building logs. The guard, a careful man who had worked here long enough to sense when routine had become a performance, slid the tablet across and waited while Sundar scrolled. There it was, a small gap in the footage. 12 minutes of darkness on the camera. Outside his office door, between 3:27 and 3:39 in the morning. No scheduled maintenance, no thunderstorm, no reason at all. Just a blink. He did not raise his voice. He never did when it mattered most. He simply looked up and said, quietly escalate this. Then he stepped into the elevator and rode up to his floor with his hands open at his sides, the way a person does when he knows there are things he cannot hold with his fingers. When the doors opened, his assistant was waiting with a stack of printouts and a pale face. Overnight, 3 journalists had sent emails about an internal crisis at the company, each one hinting that a massive deal had collapsed because of internal incompetence. It was a smear calculated and fast like a match on dry wood. He read each line and felt how lies tried to move faster than truth because lies didn't have to carry the weight of proof. He called a small meeting in a quiet room with no windows and a white table that looked like winter. Only 4 people joined him. The head of legal, a trusted security lead who had built their systems one locked door at a time, his assistant and Lena. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure if this room was meant for her. It had no mop sink, no storage shelf, no sign that said supplies. Sundar stood and pulled out the chair beside him, and she understood the invitation for what it was, not a courtesy, but a place. She sat, smoothing the fabric of her uniform as if calming a sea. He began with the simplest sentence. Someone is trying to make us afraid. The legal head nodded. The security lead tapped his pen, and Lena folded her hands to keep them from shaking. Then Sundar shared the photograph from the night before, the red message across the bottom, the camera blackout on the logs, the hints in the press. He watched their faces as the pieces aligned. Fear appeared first in the eyes that had seen the darkest corners of corporate wars. But then something else took root alongside it, resolve, built from steady practices and long habits of telling. The truth even when no one clapped. The security lead spoke first, his voice like gravel. 12 minutes is not a glitch. That's a hand on the switch. He slid a folder across the table to Sundar. We reviewed badge entries to your floor. One after-hours entry at 3:29 by a contractor credential labeled janitorial-night-A12. Except that ID was deactivated last year when the vendor changed. It should not exist. He paused, then added, whoever walked your hall used a ghost key. Lena felt her breath turn thin. Janitorial-night-A12, double quotes, the words did not just sound like a code. They sounded like a shadow stepping into a uniform that could have been hers. She glanced down at her shoes, the soles worn into Astoria. Long gaze, and she realized something with cold clarity. The people behind this were not just manipulating contracts and cameras. They were climbing through the small spaces people like her lived in. They were reaching them through vendor rosters, clipboard schedules, and the way no one looked twice at a person pushing a cart. The legal head, a careful woman with eyes that had learned to read paragraphs the way doctors read, said, "We need a containment plan and a mirror plan." Containment meant safety. Mirror meant truth reflecting back into the shadows. Sundar nodded. Then he turned to Lena and said, "You are not an accessory to this story. You are a partner. If you're willing, we'll need your help to see what we cannot see." Lena swallowed. The room felt too bright for a moment, each white surface reflecting her face back to her. She remembered her brother's hands, scarred. From work, remembered how he kept a pencil behind his ear, even when there was nothing left to write. "I'm willing," she said. And the words felt like she had just stepped onto a bridge above a dark river. They formed the plan in quiet, steady language. Security would place 2 plainclothes guards along Lena's routes, disguised as maintenance techs with tablets and boredom. Her usual shift would change by an hour in a way only she and the team knew. A safe office on the first floor would be hers if she needed to step off the map. No drama. No announcement, just a pattern altered enough to make a trap less accurate. The mirror plan was slower. Clever in a way that made the legal head's mouth twitch into the smallest shadow of a smile. They would stage a decoy signing, a simple rehearsal that looked real enough from a distance to draw out the hands that had tried to hurry Sundar's pen. The decoy contract would hold a tiny, almost invisible variation, a dot displaced by a fraction, a stylistic choice, and a clause number, a microtext watermark seated uniquely into each printed copy. This way, if any page leaked or any photo appeared, the origin trail would glow like a thread in blacklight. They would not chase the noise. They would watch it move and learn who fed it. As they finished, Sundar asked for one more check. "I want the list of everyone who had access to the boardroom documents in the last 2 weeks," he said, "including any temporary staff and outside counsel." The security lead nodded. The legal head already had the list halfway compiled. After the meeting, Sundar walked with Lena to the small, safe office. It looked like a room that had forgotten to be decorated. A plain desk, 2 chairs, a soft yellow lamp. He told her, without ceremony, about the 12 minutes of darkness outside his door. She listened without interrupting. Then he told her that the fake contractor badge used the same pattern as badges from their old cleaning vendor, the one replaced last year. Her eyes closed for a second, not from surprise but from recognition. "The old vendor had a subcontractor," she said slowly. "They handled night shift coverage when someone called in sick. Those workers were never on the main list. Some had badges with paper labels taped to the backs. You wouldn't know unless you lived in the supply closet with them. Sundar felt the shape of a new truth forming. The attack was not only against a company with bright buildings and famous products. It was against the people whose names did not appear in press releases. People whose routines were the scaffolding of everything else. That realization did more than wake his anger. It sharpened his sense of duty. The day stretched long and taut. Emails were drafted and held. Statements were prepared and delayed. The decoy contract printed with its quiet variations and then lived inside a folder that sat in a clear line of sight on a table, as if daring anyone with greedy eyes to move closer. Not loud bait, just something that would itch in the presence of those who could not resist control. Around noon, a message reached Lena's phone. It came from an address with the hour signature, clean and formal, asking her to report to conference room B14 in the sub-basement for a quick payroll verification. She read it 3 times. There was no B14. She knew the basement's the way. A ship worker knows every corridor of a hull. The language was wrong too stiff, like a person who had learned English by reading a list of rules and never speaking to anyone with a heartbeat. She did not go down. Instead, she walked the long way to the safe office and measured steps and told the security lead. He checked the system. There was no such appointment. A quiet alert rippled out through their team like a wire humming. On a different floor, a junior attorney spent his lunch staring too hard at a printer tray, as if paper could confess. His name was Mark, a decent young man who had given more of his heart to his mother's medical bills than to any ambition he had once spoken out loud. A week earlier, someone had slipped an envelope into his bicycle basket with photos that could hurt someone he loved if they saw light. The note inside was one line: "Help us trace a document," and the photos disappear. He thought he was just reporting harmless details, nothing that could injure a giant. But giants breathe air other. People breathed too, and he had not realized the size of what he had been feeding. That afternoon, the decoy contract walked on soft feet. A pair of eyes saw the folder where it sat. A hand never touched it, but a phone in a pocket lifted for a heartbeat, just high enough to swallow a quiet image. A watermark slid into the lens like a secret that wanted to be found later. The person holding the phone did not know that the dot near clause 17 carried a sequence that sang only one name. The camera blinked. The carrier of the phone exhaled. To everyone else in the room, it was just another day dot by early evening. The smear in the press had evolved, and not in an organic way. A copy-paste rumor appeared in 3 new places, each using identical phrasing, each claiming an anonymous. Source had confirmed the company was paralyzed. Sundar read them and felt a calm that other people might mistake for surrender. It was not surrender. It was the stillness of a person who has chosen not to feed a fire while he builds. The pump jockey called Lena and asked if she would take a short walk. The sun had started to sink, and the light curled along the path like petals. They walked past the sculpture garden and the small pond where ducks sometimes wagged their tails in ridiculous seriousness. He asked about her daughter, how school was going, whether the math teacher was kind. She answered in a soft voice, surprised and not surprised that a man with too many meetings would remember details she had mentioned almost by accident. He told her a story about his mother, about how she used to say that the most important noises in a house were the ones no one learned to hear, because they were too familiar. The tap that dripped once each hour, the container that rattled in, the back of a cupboard, the whisper of a turning page 2 rooms away. Pay attention to the quiet, his mother had told them. It tells you who you are. They returned to the building just as the security lead hurried toward them, not running. Not loud, but moving with purpose that tasted like metal. We have a hit, he said, the microtext watermark. The decoy photo was uploaded from a phone that just connected to the guest Wi-Fi for 63 seconds. And the username on that connection was created this morning by a mid-level counsel. He handed Sundar a card with a name printed on it. It was marked out in a small room with the blinds drawn. Mark folded into a chair and stared at his hands the way people stare at a sky that will not tell them if it will rain. He spoke in fractured sentences at first, then in longer confessions that came like a river finding a downhill slope. The envelope, the photos, the promise, the belief that he could control the damage by being careful. He had not taken money, but he had taken a step, and the step had delivered him to a cliff he had not seen. He cried once, and not for himself, but for his mother, for the way he had thought love meant doing anything to hold back the tide. Lena sat in the corner and listened with a heart that knew how fear weights the matches in a pocket and calls it safety. Sundar did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a speech soaked in fury. He asked 3 questions. Who gave you the envelope? Who collected the information? And who told you that feeding a secret to a hole would make darkness smaller? Mark answered the first 2 as best he could. The third answer was only a tear sliding off his jaw. The security lead took the phone gently, like holding something. That had become proof and grief at the same time. They traced the guest Wi-Fi session to a device that hopped between towers like a rabbit tracks snow to confuse dogs. Still, the watermark sang, and its song told them where it had been in those 63 seconds. An old email domain had uploaded the image to a server registered to a foundation with a name so generous. It almost hurt to say it aloud. Lena's eyes narrowed. She recognized the name. That foundation had once funded a community program in her neighborhood. And years ago, the subcontractor who placed temporary night janitors on big campuses had used the same foundation as a reference. To gain trust, it was a loop closed by pretending to be a circle of care.evening pulled over the campus like a soft blanket that hid hands, not faces. Sundar sent everyone home with instructions that sounded like kindness and were, in fact, strategy. Sleep, he said. Eat dinner with your families. Make ordinary time. The security lead didn't argue, even though his eyes wanted to keep scanning screens. Lena rode the shuttle to the train with one of the plainclothes guards, too. Rose behind her, pretending to play a game on his phone while watching anyone who watched her too long. When she reached her apartment, she paused at the door. Something felt off in the way air sits in a hallway. The doorbell camera, a small, cheap model her daughter had saved for, blinked the wrong color. She fished out her keys and looked down at the bottom corner of the doorframe. A thin strand of clear tape lay there, almost invisible, stretched across like a spider web. Her heart tumbled once, then stood still. She had learned this trick from a neighbor who used it to see if anyone had entered while she was gone. Place. A hair-thin thread across the crack, and if it breaks before you touch the handle, someone else has crossed your line. It was broken. She did not go inside. She stepped backward and stood beneath the hallway light, with her phone to her ear. I need help, she said when the security lead answered. 30 minutes later, 2 officers and a company security specialist stood in her living room, moving. Slowly, gently, respectfully. Nothing was trashed. Nothing shouted invasion. That was worse in a way because it meant intention. On her kitchen table, beneath the bowl where she kept spare change and a lone green marble her daughter had once found at a bus stop, lay a small black USB drive and a folded napkin. The napkin carried a short message penciled in tidy letters. We will start removing the wrong contracts from your life if you keep talking. There was a smile drawn next to the sentence, the kind a child might draw. Her daughter's room across the hall was untouched and tidy. Lena gripped the doorframe and decided in that instant what terror would not do to her. It would not turn her into a ghost in her own. The security specialist's face softened when he saw her knuckles whiten. We'll move you to a hotel. For a while, he said, company housing. Your daughter and your mother, too. Lena shook her head once, then nodded, because pride is a beautiful roof until rain starts coming through quietly and in many places at once. She called her mother with steady words and told her it was a temporary company program, a courtesy, nothing serious. Her mother did not believe the easy version, but she agreed to pack a small bag and keep her voice calm for the child. Meanwhile, Sundar returned home to find a folded note pushed through the gap at the bottom of his door. He recognized the paper stock immediately. It came from the same stationer that had printed wedding invitations for a senior executive 5 years ago. Small circles inscribed on the corner, the ink a gray that looked like rainwater. The note did not carry the same rage as before. It was cooler, which made it worse. You have one chance to sign a new beginning, it read. We will send the corrected contract tomorrow. This time, listen to people who wear suits. There was no signature, but there was a phone number in tiny type, a burner. The kind that would live for 48 hours and then die as if it had never been born. The next morning, the decoy plan entered its second phase, and the building woke to whispers that a new agreement would be signed in a different conference room, the one with the curved window that looked like a smile from the outside courtyard. The rumor was seated carefully and watered with silence. The legal had printed 3 versions of the decoy, each with a different microtext signature. The folders walked separate routes across the campus, carried by 3 different hands at 3 slightly different times. One folder crossed the cafeteria. At 11:31, passing a man who pretended to scratch his ear and, in doing so, captured an angle with a lapel camera no one could have seen, if they weren't looking for the way men like him always perform their own reflections. The day took on a strange brightness, the kind that happens when you know you're being watched and decide to walk straight anyway. Lena spent the afternoon learning the speed of her new phone's emergency button and the names of the 2 guards assigned to be near but not near. She learned one liked crosswords, and the other wrote letters to his sister, once a week on paper, because digital words felt slippery to him. They were kind without being careful in the way that makes kindness feel fake. She drank water and ate an apple and said a quiet prayer in the space between tasks, not asking to be spared, but asking for the courage to remain exactly herself. Just before sunset, the security lead burst into the safe office with eyes that tried not to look like victory too soon. We got the leak, he said, steadying his breath. The lapel camera caught the page. The watermark points to one copy, and that copy was in the hands of outside counsel for 7 minutes. He placed a printout on the desk. On it was a still frame from the camera, a hand, a sleeve, a sliver of clause 17, and the quiet glow of the microtext signature unique to counsel copy B. Outside counsel in question was a subcontracted firm brought on by Harrison's team earlier in the year for unrelated due diligence. Unrelated, except nothing was unrelated anymore. They drew a clean line between the server that held yesterday's smear and the domain registered to the Kindness Foundation that had once decorated community centers with balloons and posted photos of children painting murals. The same name sat on a document that lent credibility to a janitorial subcontractor who handed out paper labeled badges in the middle of the night. It was a circle, all right? But it was a circle like a noose. Take this to law enforcement now, the legal head said. There was no tremor in her voice. We already did, the security lead replied. I sent the packet 15 minutes ago. The state's cybercrime unit is spinning up. They asked for one more piece, proof of intent to harm. He glanced at Lena. The note on your kitchen table is that proof, but they'll want to extract prints from the USB and see if it carries anything weaponized. Lena felt something pass through her then, not fear, not relief, but the kind of clarity that sometimes arrives in emergencies, like a good friend opening a window. She looked at Sundar and said, I will not leave. I will not hide. I will work my shift tomorrow. I want them to see that I'm still here. Sundar nodded, and there was pride in the gesture, not possession. We will be beside you, he said, and she believed him, not because his words were loud, but because everything he had done since the whisper in the boardroom said the same thing without needing to be spoken. Night arrived, not like a curtain, but like water, killing spaces in the building where people had finally gone home were screens. Dimmed in chairs sat with their backs curved like tired animals. The security team worked their maps and watched their feeds. A new alert blinked at 9:08, activity on a device near Sundar's home network. A request to pair with his smart lock declined automatically by the system, then tried again, declined again. Then nothing for 6 minutes, as if whoever stood on the other side of his door was thinking through the next move with a hand on their chin. At 9:17. His phone rang. The number was the tiny type from the note. He answered with the same calm he used in earthquakes of the public kind. "Hello," he said. The voice on the other end was a woman's, smooth and professional, every syllable groomed. "Mr. Pichai, we are ready to send the corrected contract," she said. "We propose a brief signing tomorrow, off-site, private. Bring no guests." Her tone carried the hum of power that thinks it cannot be refused. "Send it," Sundar said, and when he ended the call, he looked at the security lead and the legal head and Lena, who had stayed late because leaving would have felt like an unfinished sentence. "They think I am alone," he said. "Let them keep thinking it. They did not sleep much. Someone always watched the screen. Someone always kept their shoes on. At 1 a.m. The state's cybercrime unit pinged back. The USB from Lena's table contained a small executable designed to scrape login tokens from browsers and ship them to a server housed in a country where subpoenas were treated like annoying flies. The message was clean. This was not a prank. This was a plan. The sun came up again because it likes to show off how it can do that no matter what humans are building or breaking beneath it. Lena tied her shoes and tucked a small note into her pocket, a piece of lined paper on which she had written a short letter to her brother. "I am doing this right," it said. "I am using my voice the way you taught me to hold a bolt steady while you turn the wrench. You said life is a two-person job. Today, I am both people, but I am not alone." She walked into the building, through a side entrance, a path the team had chosen because it offered visibility to friends and invisibility to strangers. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the plastic scent of new trash bags. She pushed her cart with a rhythm she had learned long before this building had ever learned her name. Halfway down the corridor, she passed a man she had never seen before. He wore the maintenance uniform, but something in the way the fabric sat on his shoulders said the shirt had been borrowed. His hands were too soft around the tablet. He smiled, but his eyes did not join in. He stepped aside politely, but there was that tiny pause, the length of a breath held and not released. As if he had expected her to turn into a different hallway, she kept moving, then took the next left and stopped in front of a glass door to check her cart. Her fingers shook for a second and then settled, because fear can ride with you without ever taking the wheel if you tell it where to sit. She dialed the security lead's number and said softly, "Blue shirt, gray cap, tablet without stickers, corridor C, near the server room." The response was low and immediate. "Copy, eyes on." 5 minutes later, a fire alarm chirped once and then died. Not a full alarm, just a single hiccup, like a rehearsal that forgot its line. Lena glanced up at the red light, and in that flicker she saw a silhouette reflected in the brushed metal of the elevator door across from her, the gray cap. He stood too close to the server room door now, his hand hovering near the access panel, his eyes scanning the hall like someone checking the weather before stepping outside with a plan to get. Wet.2 security staff, quiet as house cats, turned the corner behind him. They did not pounce. They wandered up like ordinary men about to ask an ordinary question about a lost phone charger. The gray cap looked up and performed confusion. Then he performed a smile. Then he performed goodbye. He tried to step away, but one of the guards asked the kind of question that keeps people in place without making them feel trapped. "Hey, do you happen to know if there's a spare Ethernet cable in that room? I've been trying to find one all morning." The gray cap shrugged, pretending to be bored, then made a mistake a careful person would never make. He swiped a badge at the panel that opened the server room door. The panel flashed green and chirped. The door did not open because the guard leaned his shoulder against it, as casually as if he had just remembered a joke he wanted to tell. "Weird," the guard said, smiling. "That badge should only open maintenance closets." He looked at the tablet in the man's hand. At the back, where a sticker from a competing company's event was peeling off in a way that suggested a second-hand purchase. "What's your name?" the guard asked like a friend. The man ran. There was no dramatic chase. He sprinted 20 meters, turned the corner, and collided with a cart of paper cup, which exploded into small white noises across the floor. By the time he regained his feet, The second guard had stepped into his lane the way a tree steps into wind, exactly where it has always been, unmovable. The man stopped, then sagged. The tablet slipped through his fingers and kissed the floor. With the sound of endpoints meeting consequences they had tried to avoid 10 minutes later. The gray cap sat in a small room with his hands on the table. He refused to speak. His badge, the ghost kind, bore a serial sequence that matched the deactivated vendor list. His phone, locked. His eyes, angry in a way people get when they realize their plan required everyone else to be asleep. The state's cybercrime unit arrived with quiet jackets and serious laptops. The person in charge thanked Lena first, not last, which mattered more than most people would think. The room gathered its attention around new screens, new maps, new lines that drew themselves thin and then bold. The Kindness Foundation servers began to feel the heat of official inquiry, the kind that persists. And then, in the middle of the controlled chaos, Sundar's phone vibrated again with a message that made the skin on his arms tighten. It was a photo of his front door, taken at dawn. The angle low like a child's eyes, the frame capturing the gap near the threshold where the note had slid through. Beneath the photo, a single sentence appeared. "We don't need your door." To be open to come in. At the same second, a different chime echoed in the room from the security lead's console. An access request had just been attempted on Sundar's home camera system, followed by a string of denials, followed by a strange success that shouldn't have been possible. The screen flashed, then steadied. The feed switched to a live view. Inside Sundar's living room. The camera panned, slow and deliberate, though no one on their team was controlling it. On the coffee table, there was a folded contract that none of them had placed there. The words on the front page large enough to read from across the room. Amended agreement, execution copy. Sundar's heart beat hard once, then settled. Into a rhythm of decision. He looked at Lena, who had stood to her feet without realizing it, and at the legal head and the security lead, whose faces had become pure focus. He took a breath that tasted like iron and responsibility and the stubborn sweetness of courage. Then his phone rang, and a voice he recognized from the night before spoke again. Softer now, like a person who had started whispering inside his. "Home, you have 10 minutes, the voice said. "Come alone." Sign, and everything returns to normal. The line clicked. The screen still showed his living room. A room that now looked like a stage where a play had already started without its main actor. And there, just visible at the edge of the frame, the camera caught a reflection in the window. A figure wearing a suit, standing perfectly still, watching the contract on the table. The room around Sundar felt like a long holding breath. And as he reached for his keys, Lena stepped forward with a calm that surprised even her and said, "If you go alone, you will not come back the same." The clock on the wall ticked loud enough for everyone to hear it. Outside, the campus went on being ordinary because the sky had not received the message that today was not allowed to be normal. That Sundar put his keys down, not up, and lifted his eyes. "We don't go alone," he said. The screen flickered once. More. A pair of gloved hands entered the frame. A pen rolled toward the edge of the table and stopped, as if gravity remembered its duty at the last possible moment. The camera tilted, revealing a shadow leaning forward. A face almost in view, almost named Dot then. The feed went black. Asterisk the contract on the table. Room was darker than it should have been for that hour of morning. Screens glowed against tired faces, the silence alive with questions no one yet knew how to ask. The feed to Sundar's home had gone black seconds earlier, cutting off just before the figure in the suit stepped fully into view. The silence that followed was not simply the absence of noise. It was the presence of danger pressing down on every breath. Sundar sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the white table in the safe office, his gaze fixed not on anyone in the room but on the space between thoughts. The image of his living room haunted him, the pen rolling toward the edge of the coffee table. The amended agreement spread wide across the wood like bait waiting for its prey. The shadow leaning forward as though mocking him with patience. The black screen was almost worse than the intruder himself, because absence invites imagination. And imagination can be crueler than truth. Lena stood near the wall, her heart heavy but her spine unbending. She had grown up knowing what it felt like to be powerless in the face of larger forces. But what she had also learned, through years of watching her family wrestle with loss and unfairness, was that silence often fed cruelty. If she had learned anything from her brother's tragedy, it was that doing nothing only widened the hole where decency should live. So even now, though fear clawed at her chest, she whispered to herself, "I will not be invisible." Not now. The state cybercrime unit moved quickly. Their lead investigator, a tall man with tired eyes who had once worked fraud cases in banking, leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "They're inside your home system, Sundar. This wasn't just a break-in. This was staged, performed. They wanted you to see it. They wanted control not just of your property, but of your choices. It's psychological warfare." Sundar finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "If they wanted fear, they already failed. I don't scare easily. What they want is compliance, and they won't get it." The legal head interjected, sliding papers across the table that carried details from the decoy trap. "We have enough proof to escalate now. The smear campaign, the forged contracts, the infiltrated vendors, the digital breach. We can burn them in court." She paused, her eyes heavy with reality. "But trials are long, reputations are fragile, and they know how to hit where it hurts. This isn't about contracts anymore. It's about intimidation." Lena's voice broke through, softer but sharper than the rest. "They think you'll fold because they've always won against people like men in suits stole my brother's life, and no one stopped them. They believe everyone can be bent with the right pressure." She straightened her back, her hands gripping the chair in front of her. "They are wrong." For the first time that night, Sundar turned and looked directly at her. Her words were not just defiance, they were truth. Truth spoken from scars, and truth has a way of grounding a room when fear threatens to float it away. A plan began to form, not in dramatic bursts, but in careful steps. The investigators wanted evidence of physical presence. The security team wanted to trace the digital breach back past the shadows and into a name. And Sundar, calm but determined, wanted the stage they had built in his home to become their own undoing. "If they put a contract in my living room," Sundar said slowly, "then let's make them believe I'm tempted to sign it." Gasps circled the table. The security lead shook his head, his voice rising. "That's too dangerous. They've already breached your home. What's next? Your family, your children. You cannot walk into their script." But Sundar leaned forward, his hands folding. "Sometimes the only way to end a performance is to play along long enough to expose the actors. They want me alone? Fine. But I will not be alone. Every step will be recorded, traced, mirrored back at them. If they think they can write my ending, then let's show them what happens when the ending is rewritten." Lena's chest tightened. She hated the idea of him walking into their trap, but she also understood that waiting passively was its own kind of trap. She spoke with urgency, her voice trembling but insistent. "Then I'm coming too." "Don't argue. I've seen the details they overlook. I've lived in the places they hide. You need someone who notices the quiet things." The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. The legal head frowned, knowing the risk, but Sundar looked at Lena for a long moment and finally nodded. "You've already saved me once. Maybe you'll do it again." The night stretched long. Maps of Sundar's home were drawn, potential entry points highlighted, recording devices planted with precision. The amended contract left on his table was photographed, analyzed, and replaced exactly as it had been found. Tiny trackers were hidden in the spine of the folder, ready to sing out when it moved again. Dot just before dawn, Lena sat in the safe office alone, staring at her hands. She thought of her daughter still asleep in the hotel room across town, unaware of the storm her mother had walked into. She thought of her brother, how his last days were heavy with shame he did not deserve. Tears slid down her face, quiet and unchecked, but then she wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I will not be invisible," she whispered again. Her voice firmer now, a vow spoken into the silence. By mid-morning, the trap was ready. Sundar would return home under watch. The intruders certainly would be lured back by the bait they had left. The cyber unit would monitor every network packet, every attempt at remote access. The security team would stay hidden in unmarked cars nearby. Lena would walk with him, carrying nothing but a folder of her own notes, the way someone invisible might carry her cleaning supplies, unnoticed, unimportant. But within those notes was her sharp eye, her intuition, the very thing that had exposed the first fraud. As they drove toward Sundar's house, the air in the car was thick with unspoken fear. Lena stared out the window at the passing city, her mind bouncing between memory and resolve. Sundar broke the silence finally. You don't have to do this. She turned her head, her eyes steady. And you don't have to listen to me? But here we are. When they arrived, the house looked untouched. The front door was closed, the windows calm. Yet as they stepped inside, Sundar felt immediately that the air was wrong. It was too clean, as though someone had scrubbed away the evidence of presence but left behind the smell of intrusion. The contract still sat on the coffee table, its pages waiting like a mouth ready to swallow. Sundar walked slowly to it, Lena just behind him. He reached out and then stopped. Lena's eyes caught something, a detail small enough to escape anyone else's notice. A shadow of a smudge on the corner of the page, as though someone had lifted it not with bare fingers but with gloves that left faint powder marks. She whispered quickly, "Don't touch it." And just as the words left her lips, a faint click echoed from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of a latch closing. Someone else was in the house. The whisper that ended the silence. Click was not loud. But in the stillness of the house, it rang like a gunshot. Sundar froze mid-step, the pen on the coffee table gleaming in the light, as though daring him to reach for it. Lena's heart thudded so hard she was sure the sound would give them away. She clutched her notes tighter, her breath shallow but steady. The faint scent of leather polish, out of place in his home, drifted into the living room, a reminder that strangers had already claimed this space. They were not alone. Sundar's eyes shifted toward the hallway without turning his head. His instincts told him the intruder was waiting, watching, perhaps expecting him to play the role of the obedient executive who would panic, sign, and surrender. But Sundar had built his life on discipline, not fear. He leaned slightly toward Lena and whispered, so softly that only she could hear, "Stay close to me. Notice everything." The creak of a floorboard came next, deliberate, controlled. A figure stepped into view, the man from the blurred reflection in the window, now clear under the light. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his face expressionless in a way that only professional deceivers mastered. In his gloved hand, he held another folder identical to the one on the coffee table. "Mr. Pichai," he said smoothly, as though this was a scheduled meeting. "Not a violation of law and trust. We don't need drama, just your signature." 1. Page, one pen stroke, and this all disappears. The media stops. The threats end. Life returns to normal. His tone was polite, almost gentle, but the weight beneath it was sharp as a blade. Sundar did not reply immediately. Instead, he studied the man's every detail, the faint scar near his jawline, the way he shifted his weight slightly on his left foot, the faint bulge near his coat pocket where something heavier than papers was concealed. Lena's eyes flicked to the table, then to the new folder in the man's hand. Something didn't add up. She looked closer at the pen on the table and noticed it wasn't quite right. The barrel had a faint seam near the tip, not like the pen Sundar kept in his study. Her breath caught. It wasn't a pen. It was a device. Her whisper cut the air like a blade. "Don't touch the pen." The man's eyes darted toward her, his polished calm cracking for a split second. "She shouldn't even be here," he hissed. "You listen to her, and you lose everything." Sundar's voice was steady, almost unnervingly calm. "I've built my life listening to people others ignore." The man's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, placing the folder on top of the contract already waiting on the table. "Sign," or the next message won't be on paper. It'll be on a doorstep. His eyes narrowed toward Lena, the threat unmistakable. Before Sundar could respond, the house filled with a new sound, a faint vibration, the hum of a signal coming alive. In an unmarked van parked down the street, the cybercrime team leaned forward as their trackers lit up. The tiny sensor hidden in the spine of the decoy contract activated when placed beside the intruder's folder, transmitting location, identity, and movement. The intruder didn't know it, but he had already handed them everything they needed. Back inside, Sundar stepped closer to the coffee table. The air between him and the man thickened, two wills pressing against each other. Then Sundar spoke, his words deliberate. Do you know what power really is? It isn't forcing signatures. It isn't scaring people into silence. It's when people who have nothing still choose to do the right thing. Like she did. He nodded toward Lena. The man scoffed, but his grip on control slipped further. You think truth protects you? Truth is weak without force. Lena's voice rose then, trembling but fierce. Truth is the only thing that outlives force. My brother lost everything because he trusted men like you. But his story isn't ending with me staying quiet. The man's expression hardened, his hand twitching near his coat pocket. Sundar raised a hand, calm but firm. Don't. Before the moment could break, the front door burst open. Plainclothes officers and the cybercrime team flooded in, their voices sharp, commanding, hands where we can see them. The intruder froze, his arrogance dissolving into the panic of being cornered. His folder was seized, the hidden device in the pen dismantled. Every piece of the trap pulled apart his eyes. The man was dragged out in silence. His mask of control shattered. Lena sank into a chair, her body shaking as the adrenaline drained. Sundar placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. You were right, he said softly, about everything. You noticed what the rest of us couldn't. You saved me again. She wiped her tears, her voice breaking. I only did what anyone should do. He shook his head. No. Too many people stay silent. You spoke, you risked. That makes all the difference. In the days that followed, the network unraveled. The Kindness Foundation, exposed as a shell, collapsed under investigation. Harrison and his partners were arrested, their empire of deception revealed as fragile once stripped of lies. The smear campaigns vanished as quickly as they appeared, replaced by headlines of accountability and justice. But for Sundar, the greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom or the press. It was quieter, more human. Weeks later, in a small ceremony, held not in a boardroom, but in a cafeteria, he introduced Lena to hundreds of employees. He told them how a woman most people walked past every day without noticing had seen what no one else did. How her whisper had stopped $100 million scam. How courage sometimes wears a faded uniform and carries a mop. The room erupted with applause. But Lena stood with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, she felt not invisible, but seen. Her daughter, standing in the front row, beamed with pride so bright it filled the room. Afterwards, Sundar spoke to Lena privately. You taught me something I will never forget. Power is not in the contracts, or the titles, or the suits. It's in kindness, in resilience, in respect, in voices like yours. She smiled through her tears. And in listening. The world outside continued as always. Deals signed, markets shifted, technology advanced. But those who had been in that house, in that room, in that moment of truth, knew something deeper, that sometimes the strongest walls are not made of glass or stone, but of the courage to whisper when silence would be safer. And so the story that began with the maid's quiet warning ended with a legacy of humility, resilience, and kindness. A reminder that even in the shadows of deception, a single voice can change everything. Asterisk.